Hey guys, in today's video I will show you how you can paint a simple but awesome looking gold armor trim on your Space Marines without using any metallic paint. If I asked you what element on your minis you paint in gold most frequently, most of you would probably say that it's some kind of trim or decoration. And I bet that the large majority of people trying non-metallic metal for the first time do it on some kind of armor trim as well, most likely on a Space Marine or something similar. That is how I started my first non-metallic metal attempts, and I think it's actually a pretty good entry point since trims are much easier to do than, for example, painting a whole suit of armor. So I thought I would walk you through how you can paint a really cool looking yellow gold armor trim on your minis using one of the new Saturnine Terminators, because these guys have a ton of really nice armor trim we can practice on. I will be using the gold non-metallic metal paint set from Ionic for this one, but I will also show you which AK interactive paints you can use instead, and I'll explain the color choices so you can find similar paints in whatever range you're using. And on top of the colors, I will also talk about the highlight placements, the techniques to paint those highlights, and all the tricks I use to make it look good in the end. Painting non-metallic metal for the first time can be quite intimidating, so I will show you a pretty simple but still impressive looking version. I think it's a good standard to aspire to when you start out, and then once you are more proficient with non-metallic metal, you can spice it up with colored secondary reflections and whatever else your heart desires. In the end of the video I will give you some ideas about how you can do that as well, but let's start with a simple gold first. But before I began on the gold, I painted this Saturnine Terminator in a nice rusty red color, which will look great next to our gold trim, and since I used the airbrush for that one, I needed to paint all the trim back to a dark color so we can start with the non-metallic metal highlights with the brush. By the way, if you want to know how I painted this guy from start to finish, including the red armor, the gold trim, all the steel elements and the glow effects, you can find the PDF guides and the real-time painting footage on my Patreon. I'll put the link in the video description. And right from the start, I want to paint with something that has a little color in it. Instead of pure black, I base coat the entire trim with black purple. And this is a super dark color, almost black, but it still has a hint of purple in it, so it will give us a much nicer looking shadow. You can start from a simple black, of course. For example, you can just use the black primer as your base color, but you will lose out on that little extra oomph that the purple shadow would give you. Usually when you begin painting the trim, you have to clean it up anyway, because you probably messed it up either with the brush or the airbrush when you painted the armor panels, so you might as well clean it up with a dark purple color instead of a black. Okay, now that the trim is nice and clean, it's time to start with the actual non-metallic metal recipe, and here are the paints I am planning to use for this one. In the end, I won't use the orange colors because I didn't paint any secondary reflections on this project, but if you want to go for a really complex gold, those will come in handy. Okay, let's start with the first step, and it's actually quite easy because we can cover almost the entire trim with this color. I'm using cardinal purple here, which is another purple color, but this time a little brighter than the black purple base coat. If I painted with AK colors, I would use whole red here, which is a little brighter, resulting in a bigger jump in value, but it would still produce a similar result. I paint multiple layers for full coverage, especially where I want the highlights to be the brightest, so mostly on the top of the trim, and I leave a little area, maybe 10% of the trim unpainted, where I want the deepest shadows to be, usually at the very bottom of the trim. But we will talk about highlight placement a bit more later when it becomes more important with the lighter colors. And the difference between this color and the base coat is not huge, but we want to build up the effect gradually with small jumps in value, so we won't have to do that much smoothing. In fact, I don't do any smoothing at this stage. Okay, let's take a look at the end result. Here you can see that I covered most of the surface of the trim, but at the bottom of the pauldrons and in the shadow areas of the trim on the legs, I left a little of the original black purple. Now let's jump a little higher in value and move towards more brownish red colors. I will use dark skin for this, but if you use AK, you can go with beast brown, for example. Once again, it will be a little lighter, so more smoothing is needed, but the end result is similar. And again, the difference between this and the previous color will be subtle, but that is exactly what we want. And at this stage, not a lot of thinking or finesse is needed. I simply cover the same areas as with the previous color, but now I make the highlights even smaller, covering about 80% of what I painted before. I don't touch the darkest parts with this anymore, except for the edges. With this paint, I cover all the edges, even those inside the deepest shadows. The highlights can be quite rough and thick at this point, but we need to get all the edges. And if you're wondering why we paint with super dark purple and reddish brown colors when we want a yellow gold in the end, the answer is that the colors inside actual gold usually range from almost pure black through warm brown, ochre yellow, all the way to pure white, plus any colors that might be reflected in the metal. And this huge contrast between the extremes from black to white is what makes it look metallic. So right now we are painting the dark end of this range, the colors that will make up the shadows in the metal. That is why we use the super dark purple and brown colors. And if you look at the end result of this step, now the highlights and the shadows are easier to see. On the smaller elements like the trim on the knees, we have one big highlight area, and on the bigger elements like the pauldron, I made a super big highlight on the top and a smaller one on the bottom, separated by 2 shadow areas for contrast. Alright, now it's time to get serious and really commit to the light placement by using some much less subtle colors. From the reddish browns, now we switch to a brownish yellow ochre color, dark ochre from Ionic or the slightly lighter Japanese brown from AK. And here's what we are going to do. I will once again paint solid highlights inside the previous ones, but now I make them even smaller, only covering around 80% of the previous color. But this tone stands out much more from the previous one, so we need to think about smoothing out the border between the two and creating a transition. The way I do this is by making thin diagonal lines on the border. This simulates how light can reflect on metals like the trim. Then I use the previous darker color but much more thin down, and I glaze it over the border between the two colors and the lines I created. Doing this a couple of times smooths out the transition between the two colors and integrates everything together. But there is one more important thing I need to do. I edge highlight almost everything again with this color and I paint all the rivets. I only leave out the edges in the deepest shadows. Metallic objects tend to have very bright edges, so if we want to fool our eyes into thinking that this is metal, we need to make the edges bright. I have a video about edge highlights on the channel, so if you have trouble painting them, check it out. People seem to find that one quite useful. And looking at the end result of this step, we can see that the effect is taking shape. The highlights are obvious, the definition is there since the edges and all the rivets are painted, but the contrast is too low for this to look metal, and the colors are too brownish for something that is supposed to be gold. So let's do something about it by finally switching to more yellowish tones. Bubonic ochre from Ionic or a mix of Japanese brown and dirty yellow from AK. From now on, we just have to repeat the same process that we used in the previous step over and over again, but on a smaller and smaller surface and by painting less and less of the edges. In fact, I only painted the edges pointing up towards the light with this one and left the ones facing away from the light painted in the previous colors. But here we need to talk about one of the biggest problems people run into when attempting non-metallic metal gold. Usually the end result turns out to be a muddy grayish color, a far cry from the shining yellow gold they had in mind when they started. And that usually happens due to one major mistake: the use of colors with a lot of white mixed in. If you look at all the tones we use so far, there is none that has any white in it. We are at the middle of the highlighting stage, basically painting the midtones, but everything we use so far is nice and saturated. But eventually, as we go higher in brightness, at some point we need to resort to using white if we want to get the contrast that is needed for non-metallic metal. And if we do that too early and make the whitish highlights too big, that will overpower all the nice saturated colors we used before and make the whole thing look washed out and muddy. So let's keep this in mind, but for now we can still increase the brightness and get closer to a pure yellow without resorting to any whites. So the next color will be golden yellow from Ionic or dirty yellow from AK. Once again, I repeat the same process but on an even smaller surface. I paint only the edges that are fully facing the light and all the rivets, even those in the shadow areas. It is important to paint the edges that are facing the light even if they are in the area that is otherwise dark. This contrast between the bright edge and the dark surface contributes to the metallic effect. And one more thing to consider is to create a difference in contrast not only inside the individual elements but over the whole model. And this sounds very complicated, but it's actually quite easy. Usually you want the upper half of the model more brightly highlighted than the bottom, so there is a contrast between the brighter top and the darker bottom half of the model. And you can do this by painting larger highlights on the top half than on the bottom half. In this case, the huge trims on the pauldrons and the comparatively smaller trims on the legs kinda do this for us naturally, but I also added to this effect by making a large highlight on the top of the pauldron and only a much smaller one at the bottom. You can also use another little trick where you make one side of an object a little lighter than the other. For example, I intentionally made the right side of the eagle symbol lighter by making bigger highlights on it. The difference tricks the eye into thinking that the whole thing looks better. Now with the next set of highlights, we run into this issue of having to use whites to go brighter. We use primary yellow from Ionic or lemon yellow from AK. These are both much brighter than the previous gold yellow and they each contain a tiny bit of white, although the lemon yellow much more so than the Ionic paint. This doesn't change our process significantly, except that now I will cover much less of the previous color, making only smaller highlights. If previously I covered 80% of the previous color, now I will cover maybe 40-50%. This way I can maintain nice saturated colors in the midtones. As we discussed before, I concentrate these highlights on the top half of the model, covering more in the largest highlights but making quite small ones on the trim on the legs. I'm also getting more and more selective with the edges I paint, and I try to make my edge highlights really thin and neat from this point on. And since this color stands out a lot from the previous one due to its brightness, I spend a little more time glazing over the border to smooth things out. Looking at the end result of this step, now the metallic effect is coming together as we increase the contrast between the light and the shadow areas, and we are still doing quite well in terms of saturation. The trim still looks nice and vibrant. Now it's time to go more extreme with the highlights and push the contrast even more. For this I will use slime yellow from Ionic or laser yellow from AK. These colors have quite a bit of white in them but also some green, and this greenish tone will contrast nicely with the golden yellows we have on the trim. This little trick will make the highlights look even brighter than they actually are, and this plays nicely with some green secondary highlights if you want to add those later. Now I'm really reducing the size of the highlights and the edges I paint with this. On the bottom half of the model I only paint some super small solid highlights where there is still space for them, and mostly just use partial edge highlights on the edges hit most by the light. On the pauldron I still make bigger highlights, especially on the very top where there is still plenty of space to cover inside the main light. But it's very important to leave a lot of the previous colors and not to cover too much at this point. If you look at the end result, we can see that maybe we lost a little bit of the saturation, but we gained a lot of brightness and the armor looks way shinier now. Alright, we are getting really close to the end and it's time to give in to using white. So I'll do this penultimate step with vanilla from Ionic or ice yellow from AK. These paints are very close to pure white with only a little yellow in them. So now I reduce the size of the highlights even more. I only paint small solid areas inside the biggest main ones on the top of the pauldrons, and everywhere else I only use thin edge highlights, mostly just covering a part of the edge and sometimes just doing some dots. I also concentrate on the side of the elements I wanted brighter, like on the right side of the eagle. At this point precision is way more important than before as well, so while I started with a relatively big size 2 brush when I painted the first couple of highlights, throughout the process I switched to smaller and smaller brushes. So now I'm using a 00 to make sure the edge highlights and the dots are the thinnest and smallest I can make them. Looking at the end result, we didn't really lose too much saturation since we reduced the area we covered so much, but now we are almost there in terms of contrast and the trim starts to really shine. Now finally with pure white I only add some dots here and there and some super small partial edge highlights, mostly on the most valid corners and edges, the tips of the rivets, and a couple of glints in otherwise darker areas. It is important not to overdo this, but a couple of well-placed glints with white can add a lot to the overall effect. Alright, the end result looks pretty good, but despite our best efforts we lost a little bit of color from the midtones. The nice warm browns we used initially are somehow missing. And this is quite typical and very hard or even impossible to avoid in my experience, but it's very easy to fix. So we take an ink like maple from Ionic, or you can also use a sepia from other brands, and we glaze it into the midtones where the darker yellowish colors meet the much darker browns and purples, moving the paint from the lighter colors into the darker ones by finishing the brush strokes there. We simply take advantage of the fact that inks are very saturated but also quite transparent. This way we can bring back the color we lost without losing the details we painted. And then if you want we can go even further using something like mahogany, which is a more reddish color than maple. I glaze this even further into the dark colors, but if I overlap it a little with some of the yellows it will produce a subtle reddish reflection in the gold, which works quite well next to the red armor panels. And with that the gold armor trim is basically finished, and while it's quite simple I think it actually looks quite nice. If you want to go even further you can add some environmental lights onto it as well to make it even more interesting. For example, when I was painting the green glow effect I intentionally oversprayed the green fluorescent paint a bit over the bottom of the pauldron and on the legs where the trim was close to the plasma coils. I did this with the airbrush, but you can also just glaze a little green fluo paint over these areas and it will produce a similar effect. It's pretty simple but it works quite well. And the end result looks like this. I hope this video will make it a little easier for some of you to paint non-metallic metal gold trims on your minis. Painting non-metallic metal can be some of the most challenging but also the most fun things in mini painting, so I think any painter should at least attempt it a couple of times. Just be careful, once you do it once, it's hard to stop. If you liked the video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and maybe drop a comment under it as well. It really helps with the algorithm showing it to other people. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible, and that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.